Henry Corner had finally achieved success beyond his wildest dreams, and it all suddenly seemed so simple. After months of experimentation and preparation, he was finally hovering above his body, feeling superhuman and marvelling at the practical potentialities of his discovery. There below him lay what he called his husk, appearing deceased, but he knew to be simply deserted for now and awaiting his return to be used as a base for his operations. Henry was very happy to continue his warm and nurturing life and engaged to be married. Over the last 7 months, his scientific work had evolved from one of a detached and practical pathologist until a chance series of investigations had uncovered one clue which led to other work and this final success. As Henry hovered there in his quiet study above his husk, he started to mentally document his sensations and awarenesses. He felt his normal size and shape, but floating in, rather than air, a fluid of very thin consistency, like a goldfish in a bowl. When he looked at objects, even his own body, he was able to see through them with a bizarre 3D X-ray effect. He floated down and attempted to write at his desk, but found he had no power to do so. Momentarily glimpsing a picture of his fiancée Emily Trigot, Henry thought how proud she would be of him, now able to command 2 worlds. He soon had the idea of exploring, drifted to the door, but found himself unable to open it. He then realised that the windows were open and had little difficulty in floating through one of them. He had become an explorer in another dimension, at first with a fear of falling from his 2nd-floor laboratory window, as well as a fear of being seen by bypassers in the street, before realising that neither was going to happen. He was invisible and no bodily dangers could affect him. He was able to see not only stunning views, but also iridescent colours he had not known existed as he swam off his windowsill and into the ether. To his still nascent senses, he found the outside air made up of myriads of thread-like filaments through which he was able to float without disturbing them, while an endless stream of tiny sparks rhythmically crackled and buzzed around him. As he drifted away, he looked back at his house and realised that all around it were gathered other invisible figures like himself, but unlike him, they were the spirits of the departed. Suddenly aware of floating spirit figures on all sides of him, he soothed himself with the thought that this was a natural and logical phenomenon. What really shook him was that when he tried to communicate with them, these spirits wanted nothing to do with him. For the first time, he started to experience a very human feeling of fear. Henry eventually recognised one of the spirits, a Reverend Dr. Fielding, who had passed some 2 years previously. He quietly addressed the kindly doctor, expressing joy at having found him in a new life. However, the doctor's response shocked Henry as he turned on him with a savage recognition and curtly pointed him back to his own house. Henry later wished that he had heeded the doctor's gesture. As he continued to explore, in amazement at what he was witness to, other angry spirits began to crowd around Henry, and he decided to return home before he was missed or his body discovered. He realised that he was now 6 miles from home, and as night set in, he began to feel powerless and in peril. Evil faces flickered around him, growing in number. Exhausted, Henry finally reached home, but was shocked to see that someone had closed all the windows. As a novel astral traveller, he realised that he was unable to re-enter his home and therefore body. To add to his frantic terror, he could see that his body had been laid out as if in preparation for a burial. The malignant, sneering presences around him seemed to be multiplying and were pressing in on him. As he ineffectually beat upon the windows, he watched his housekeeper aunt weeping bitterly over his body, and then his fiancée Emily rush into the room, seemingly crazed by her loss. For one hopeful moment, she advanced to the window, but was seized and dragged away by her father. Henry miserably hovered around the house all night and later observed Emily's father and Dr. Marshall arranging for Emily to be taken away to a mental institution. Henry's body was now placed in a heavily lidded coffin, and the doctor seemed to be orchestrating a hasty burial, probably to spare Emily further pain. Then came the funeral, which she observed still mobbed by the sinister presences. After the shattering event, Henry decided to make for the Pines Mental Hospital, where he had heard a mourner state that Emily had been placed. At least he could stay close to her until he finally lost his senses. Emily, meanwhile, had pretended to take the sleeping powder provided by the doctor. She then listened as he and her father discussed the unsuitability of Henry Corner as a husband for her due to his spiritual experimentation. They had concluded that it was a blessing that he had passed. Remembering Henry's efforts to master astral travel, Emily suddenly had the hope that Henry may be able to return, and she declared the possibility to the two men. Her distressed outburst when she was told that Henry had already been buried had resulted in her hasty dispatch to the sanatorium. There, she acted like the perfect patient so that her straitjacket was eventually removed. In the dead of night, Emily pried open the bars of her window, stole a shovel from the hospital tool house, and sprinted barefoot across the fields until she reached the cemetery. Here, Emily was able to feel the pressure of the hostile souls who bore down on her as she made her way to Henry's fresh grave. She dug furiously in a darkness inhabited by humanoid shapes, entities which clutched at her, trying to stop her. As she uncovered the coffin, their onslaught intensified, and the night air was filled with their sneering hisses and mocking laughter. Despite self-doubt clouding her senses, Emily persevered with her manic digging, fueled by the superhuman strength which had also enabled her to part the mental bars in her hospital cell, the strength she derived from her love of Henry. In the meantime, Dr. Marshall had been informed of Emily's escape from the asylum. Remembering her earlier ravings about graves and burials, he and his head nurse clambered into his roadster and set out by the shortest route to the cemetery. He anxiously anticipated finding Emily collapsed at the graveside, possibly having contracted pneumonia as she was so thinly dressed. On rounding the final turn, he stared ahead, nearly crashing his car. The earth had been dug from a particular grave, the coffin half wrenched out and broken open, and on a nearby mound sat two figures. The sight of Emily Trudeau and Henry Corner, whom he had certified deceased and ordered a premature burial for, sent his senses reeling. The young man's hair was snowy white, but he was alive and rational. Gasping and completely unnerved, Dr. Marshall watched as the reunited couple embraced. He was stupefied but ecstatic that Emily had acted on the call she believed she heard with the desperate courage of her love for Henry.